The land came first, before the cattle, before the cabin, before the man. There was the land. It stretched from one end of the world to the other, a sea of amber grass that rippled and bowed under a sky so vast and blue it could make a man feel like a crawling insect. In the far distance, the mountains tore at the horizon, their peaks like the jagged, purple teeth of some ancient, sleeping beast. This was Wyoming in the 1870s, a place of terrible beauty and profound indifference. It did not care if a man lived or died. It simply was. And on this land lived Elias Vance. He was a man shaped by the very landscape he inhabited, weathered, silent, and vast in his own loneliness. At 38, his face was a map of his years, the lines around his eyes etched by a relentless sun, the set of his jaw hardened by a sorrow that had taken root deeper than any prairie grass. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who has only himself for company. His days were a ritual of work, a steady rhythm that kept the ghosts at bay. Mornings began before the sun, with the sharp, clean smell of coffee boiling over a small fire. He would stand on the porch of his Spartan log cabin, a single structure against the endless roll of the plains, and watch the sky bleed from bruised purple to pale rose. Then the work would start. He mended fences with practiced hands, the wire biting into his calloused palms, his movements economical and sure. He rode the perimeter of his land, his body a familiar weight in the saddle, his eyes scanning the herd of longhorn cattle that were his only companions. They were stubborn, stupid creatures, but they were alive, and their lowing was one of the few sounds that punctuated the profound silence of his life. The other sound was the wind, a constant, sighing presence that whispered through the grass and moaned around the corners of the cabin. A lonely song for a lonely man. Evenings brought the lonely ritual of a meal for one. He would cook bacon and beans in a cast-iron skillet, the sizzle and pop a brief, loud intrusion. He ate at a rough-hewn table, his own shadow stretching long and thin in the flickering lamplight. The cabin was a testament to his existence. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth. It was clean, orderly, and empty of anything that spoke of softness or joy, except for one corner. In that corner, shrouded in shadows, sat a small rocking chair made of pale ash wood. A dusty, hand-stitched quilt was draped over its back. The colors faded from sun and time. Elias never looked directly at it. His eyes would slide past that corner as if it were a hole in the fabric of the room, a place of sharp edges he dared not touch. Sometimes, when his chores were done and the sun was setting, he would walk to a low hill that overlooked the cabin. There, a small, weathered wooden cross stood stark against the sky. His hand, thick and rough from his work, would sometimes lift as if to touch the wood, but it always fell short, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. He would stand there for a long time, a solitary figure watching the world sink into darkness, before turning back to the cold comfort of his empty home. The past was not a memory for Elias. It was a presence. It lived in that rocking chair. It lived under that wooden cross. It came to him in fragments when his guard was down, in the dead of night or the quiet of the empty plains. It was the scent of lavender, the soap his wife Sarah had always used, mingled with the thick, metallic smell of blood. It was the memory of a single, weak cry from a baby too small to live, a sound that was swallowed almost instantly by a terrible, final silence. Most of all, it was Sarah's face, pale as milk against the sweat-dampened pillow, her eyes losing their light, her hand growing cool in his. That day had hollowed him out, scraped him clean of hope. He had brought her west with promises of a new life, a family, a future built with their own hands. He had been proud. He had believed in his own strength to protect them, to provide for them, and he had failed. He had watched, helpless, as a life he was meant to cherish was torn apart by a breech birth and the town doctor's drunken incompetence. God, he thought, had punished him for his pride. He was a good man, a decent man, but he carried a curse. Love, for him, was a prelude to the grave. So he had built his walls high and thick, resigned himself to this solitary life, believing it was the only penance he could offer, the only way to ensure he never brought such ruin upon another soul. Miles away, closer to the raw settlement of Prairie Creek, another solitary life was being lived. Lena's home was not a cabin built to stand against the wind, but a crude dugout carved into the side of a gently sloping hill. It was a shelter born of necessity, its roof thick with sod and prairie grass, its entrance a simple wooden door. Here, Lena survived. She was a woman in her late 20s, her heritage written in the elegant lines of her face. She had her Cheyenne mother's high cheekbones and long, straight hair, black as a raven's wing, but her eyes were a startling gray-green, a gift from the French trapper who was her father. This mixture made her a puzzle to the people of Prairie Creek, and people in small, hard places did not like puzzles. They preferred things to be simple, black or white. Lena was neither, and so she was an outcast. She moved through the landscape with a knowledge Elias could not comprehend. While he managed his herd, she foraged, her eyes scanning the ground for the specific curl of a leaf, the telltale color of a root, her hands, nimble and sure, dug yarrow for fevers and plantain for wounds, her understanding of the earth a legacy from a mother she barely remembered. She was fiercely independent because she had no other choice. Resilience had been grown in her like a second spine, a necessary armor against a world that had rejected her from the moment she was born. Her isolation was not the quiet, self-imposed kind that cloaked Elias. Hers was a thing of whispers and sideways glances. This was never clearer than on her rare trips into Prairie Creek for supplies she could not hunt or grow herself. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place held together by suspicion and a rigid, unforgiving faith. When Lena entered the general store, a bell jangling harshly above the door, a hush would fall. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, would serve her with curt reluctance, his movements stiff, his eyes avoiding hers as he measured out flour and salt. He would take her coins without his fingers touching hers. Today was no different. 2 women were in the store, one of whom was Martha Miller, the wife of the town's preacher. They stopped their conversation as Lena walked in, their mouths tightening into thin lines. Martha Miller pulled her young daughter closer, her hand a protective shield on the child's shoulder, as if Lena were a carrier of some unseen plague. The whispers started then, quiet but sharp, like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. Lena did not need to hear the words. She had been hearing them her whole life. Heathen, half-breed. She kept her back straight, her chin high, and stared straight ahead as she waited for Mr. Henderson to fill her order. She paid, nodded a curt thank you that was not returned, and walked back out into the unforgiving sunlight, the weight of their scorn a physical thing on her shoulders. She had learned long ago that to show hurt was to give them a victory. Survival meant showing nothing at all. Prairie Creek was a town held in the tight grip of Reverend Miller. From his pulpit each Sunday, he preached a gospel of fire and fear, of a wrathful God who demanded purity and punished deviance. He saw sin in anything that strayed from his narrow path, and he saw Lena, with her knowledge of earthly remedies and her native blood, as a heathen influence festering at the edge of his righteous community. She was a living, breathing symbol of the wildness he sought to tame, a temptation of the flesh and the devil that he warned his flock against. His words found fertile ground in men like Silas Croft. Croft was a rancher whose own land was rockier and drier than most. He had long coveted Elias Vance's spread, with its reliable creek and good grazing land. He saw Elias's isolation as a weakness, and now he saw this woman, Lena, as another. He watched her from a distance sometimes, a speculative gleam in his eye. He spread rumors in the saloon, painting her as a sly temptress, a squaw who had likely cast some spell on the grieving rancher to get at his property. The town, a tinderbox of prejudice and fear, listened and nodded. Gossip was their currency, and they were always looking for a spark. The spark came not from a person, but from the sky. The day had dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn morning painted in shades of gold and blue. Elias was miles from his cabin, riding the northern edge of his property, checking on a section of fence that had been weakened by a summer storm. The air was still, holding the scent of dry grass and distant pine. But by midday, a change began. A low, gray bank of clouds appeared on the northwestern horizon, a smudge of charcoal against the blue. Elias saw it and felt a prickle of unease. He had seen skies like this before. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, picked up a sudden, biting edge. The temperature began to drop, not gradually, but as if a door to a vast, cold cellar had been thrown open. He turned his horse, spurring it into a trot that quickly became a canter. He needed to get the herd closer to the shelter of the small canyon near his cabin. The sky darkened with shocking speed, the sun vanishing behind a sheet of bruised, swirling gray. The world lost its color, bleached to shades of gray and white. Then the first flakes of snow began to fall, not the soft, gentle flakes of a winter morning, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising gale. Within the hour, the world vanished. A blinding whiteout descended, a terrifying force of nature that erased the landscape. The mountains, the plains, even the ground beneath his horse's hooves disappeared into a churning vortex of wind and ice. The wind howled, a physical wall of sound that deafened and disoriented him. Elias pulled his collar up and his hat down, leaning low over his horse's neck, giving the animal its head, praying it remembered the way home. Every instinct screamed at him. This was a killer storm, the kind that came early and with a fury that could strip a man to the bone and bury him in minutes. Lena had been caught out too. She had been checking the trap lines she kept along a frozen creek bed, a few miles from her dugout. The suddenness of the storm had taken her by surprise. She had tried to make it back, fighting against a wind that stole her breath and clawed at her clothes. The snow blinded her, and soon she was lost, staggering through a world that had no landmarks, no direction. The cold sank into her bones, a deep, numbing ache that turned her muscles to lead. Her strength gave out. She collapsed against a large rock formation, a dark shape in the swirling white, and huddled there, her body slowly being covered by the accumulating drifts. Consciousness began to slip away, the roaring of the wind fading to a distant hum. Elias was a specter in the storm, fighting his way back to the meager sanctuary of his cabin. He was almost there, recognizing the shape of the low hills near his property more by feel than by sight, when his horse shied violently, whinnying in terror. Elias peered through the maelstrom, his eyes stinging. He saw a dark mound against a familiar outcropping of rock, a mound that did not belong. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and fought his way toward it. It was a person, a woman. Her face was pale and dusted with ice, her lips blue. He recognized her instantly. It was the half-breed woman from the dugout. His first instinct was the caution that had become his shield, the rule that had governed his life for 5 empty years. Do not get involved. This was not his trouble. Bringing her into his home, into his life, was inviting a connection he did not want, could not bear. It was inviting the town's judgment. It was inviting the world back in. He could turn around, get to his cabin, and pretend he had seen nothing. The storm would cover her, and by spring, no one would be the wiser. The thought was cold and ugly, and it shamed him. He looked down at her still form, at the way the snow was gently, murderously, tucking a white blanket around her. He saw not a half-breed, not a stranger, but a human being on the verge of freezing to death. His fundamental decency, the bedrock of the man he had been before grief had walled him in, won out over his fear. He could not leave her to die. He could not add that sin to the failure that already haunted his soul. With a groan of effort that was lost in the wind, he bent down. The effort to lift her was grueling. She was a dead weight, and the wind fought him every step of the way, trying to tear her from his grasp. He managed to heave her limp body over the front of his saddle, then grabbed the reins and began the agonizing final push toward the cabin. He half carried, half dragged her the last 100 yards, his lungs burning, his own body screaming in protest. He stumbled through the cabin door, dragging her inside with him, and kicked it shut against the storm. He threw the heavy wooden bar across it, the sound a loud, definitive thud in the sudden, muffled quiet. The shrieking wind was now a muted howl outside the log walls. He stood there for a moment, panting, the scent of snow and freezing wool filling the small space. He looked down at the unconscious woman on his floor, then around at the stark, lonely room that had been his fortress against the world. He had just barred the door, but in doing so, he had unknowingly locked himself in with the one person who would change the course of his life forever. Outside, the world disappeared. Inside, something new and terrifying had just begun. For 3 days, the world was nothing but the 4 log walls of the cabin and the ceaseless howl of the wind. The blizzard raged, a monstrous living thing that clawed at the roof and threw itself against the shutters, enforcing an isolation so complete it felt as if the rest of the earth had been scoured from existence. Inside this small bubble of survival, the silence was as loud as the storm. The initial hours, and then days, were fraught with a tension thick enough to taste. Elias moved about the cabin with a grim purpose, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He was a man locked in with his ghosts, and now, with a stranger who was a living, breathing complication he did not want. He chopped wood, stoked the fire, and checked the door, his movements sharp and uncommunicative. He was a creature of habit and solitude, and her presence was a disruption to the fragile peace he had built around his grief. Lena watched him from the bed where he had placed her. She was weak. The deep cold of the storm still settled in her bones, but her mind was sharp. Her pride, a shield she had carried her entire life, was a raw and tender thing. She was beholden to this man, this stranger, and her ingrained mistrust of white men made her guarded and wary. She watched his hands, the way he handled his axe, the way he moved. She watched his eyes, trying to gauge the man behind the haunted expression. Was he kind, or was he merely practical? Would he help her only to demand something in return? Every man she had ever known, starting with her own father, had wanted something. He tended to her frostbite with a clumsy gentleness that confused her. Her feet were swollen and discolored, the pain a dull, throbbing fire. He mixed a salve of lard and herbs from a small tin, the smell pungent and clean. When he touched her, his hands were hesitant, his calloused fingers surprisingly careful as he worked the ointment into her skin. It was an impersonal touch, the way a man might treat an injured animal he was trying to save. He wrapped her feet in clean rags, his face set in a grim line, his eyes focused on the task, never meeting hers. He was doing what was necessary, nothing more. Words were scarce, brittle things that shattered in the charged air between them. When he offered her a tin cup of water, he would only grunt. When she accepted, her "thank you" was a quiet murmur, barely audible over the wind. Yet, in the shared ordeal of survival, a different kind of communication began to take root. A connection began to form in the small, repeated rituals that kept them alive. He kept the fire in the stone hearth roaring, a bulwark of warmth and light against the raging cold and dark. He seemed to have a sixth sense for when it needed another log, rising from his chair to feed the flames before they had a chance to die down. The constant, steady heat was a comfort that went beyond mere physical warmth. It was a sign of his vigilance, his unspoken commitment to keeping them both from the freezing death that waited just outside the door. He made broth for her, boiling a piece of salted beef until it was tender, then bringing her the steaming liquid in a bowl. It was simple sustenance, but for Lena, who had spent a lifetime fending for herself, the act of being cared for was a foreign and unsettling feeling. She drank it without complaint, the warmth spreading through her chest, her body slowly, gratefully, beginning to heal. As her strength returned, her observations of him sharpened. She noticed the way he meticulously cleaned his rifle each evening, the practiced, rhythmic motion of the cleaning rod a kind of meditation for him. She saw the profound sadness that would settle in his eyes when he stared into the fire, his mind clearly somewhere far away, in a place of deep shadow. From her cot, she could see through the cabin's single window. It looked out upon the low hill and the small, stark wooden cross that stood atop it. She saw how his gaze would often drift to that spot, his expression hardening into a mask of old pain. He was a man living in a tomb of his own making, and she was beginning to understand why. He, in turn, began to see past the half-frozen woman he had rescued. He noticed her resilience, the way the light returned to her gray-green eyes day by day. She was not a person who accepted weakness in herself. He saw the quiet intelligence in her gaze as she watched him, the way she seemed to be measuring him, understanding him, without needing him to say a word. One afternoon, she sat up and asked for his sewing kit. He handed it to her, a small wooden box with needles, thread, and a thimble. He had a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt, a jagged rip from a stray piece of barbed wire, with small, neat stitches. She mended it. The repair was almost invisible, a testament to a lifetime of making do, of preserving what little one had. The simple domestic act, performed in the quiet of the snowbound cabin, struck him with a strange force. It was a gesture of quiet dignity, and it made the cabin feel, for a moment, less like a shelter and more like a home. On the third night, the storm reached its terrible peak. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the cabin groaned under the immense, shifting weight of the snow on its roof. The timbers creaked and popped, and it felt as if their small sanctuary might be crushed at any moment. The sheer, overwhelming power of the gale seemed to break something loose in Elias. He was standing by the hearth, a cup of coffee held forgotten in his hand. His gaze was fixed on the far corner of the room, on the small, unused rocking chair draped in its dusty quilt. For the first time since she had arrived, Lena saw his stoic facade crumble completely. A look of raw, naked agony crossed his face. It was a pain so profound it seemed to steal the very breath from his lungs. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss from which he knew he could never return. Lena's own life of hardship had taught her to read the silent language of sorrow. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of a soul that had been shattered and poorly pieced back together, acting on an instinct she did not fully understand. She broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, a calm current in the raging storm of his grief. Whose was it? The simple query, just 3 words spoken softly into the roaring dark, struck Elias like a physical blow. He flinched, his shoulders hunching as if to ward off an attack. He turned to look at her, his eyes wide and vulnerable. It had been 5 years since anyone had asked him a question that mattered. 5 years since he had spoken a word of the truth that was eating him alive from the inside out. The question, so gentle and direct, did not offer him an escape. It simply held a space for an answer. And in that moment, the dam of his grief, so carefully constructed over so many years, finally broke. He sank into the chair at the table, his movement stiff and wooden. He started to speak, his voice a raw, cracked thing, the sound of a voice unused to bearing the weight of emotion. At first, the words came in a halting trickle, then in a flood, a long, desperate confession spoken to the flickering shadows of the cabin. He told her everything about Sarah. He spoke of meeting her back in Ohio, of her laughter and the way she smelled of lavender. He told Lena of their hopeful journey west, of the dream they had shared. A piece of land, a herd of cattle, a house full of children. He spoke of the pure, uncomplicated joy he had felt when she told him she was pregnant, a joy so bright it had felt like the sun had taken up residence inside his chest. He had been so proud, so sure of himself, so certain he could build a perfect life for them out here on this wild land. Then his voice dropped, growing thick with the horror of the memory. He recounted the day of the birth in stark, bloody detail. The baby was breech, turned the wrong way. The labor went on for a full day and a night, a marathon of agony that had drained the life from Sarah's body. He had ridden for the town doctor, a man named Henderson, only to find him passed out drunk in the back of the saloon. He had ridden back alone, helpless. He described the terrible final hours, the blood, the screams that grew weaker and weaker until they stopped. He had held his wife's hand as she died, and he had held his newborn daughter, a tiny, perfect thing who had let out a single, weak cry before joining her mother in a silence that had filled the cabin and had never, ever left. "I killed them," he whispered, his voice finally breaking into a choked sob. He buried his face in his rough hands. "It was my pride. I brought her out here. So far from everything, I thought I could handle it all myself. I thought I was strong enough. God saw my pride, and He punished me for it. He took them both to show me what I was, a failure." In the quiet that followed his confession, the only sounds were the howl of the wind and the ragged sound of Elias's weeping. The cabin was filled with the weight of his grief, a palpable, suffocating thing. Lena let the silence stretch, giving his sorrow the respect it deserved. When he finally grew quiet, his shoulders still shaking, she began to speak. Her voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the raw emotion of his own story. She told him of her own past, a story not of a single catastrophic loss, but of 1,000 small cuts that had left just as deep a scar. She told him of her father, a French trapper named Jean-Paul, who had fallen in love with her Cheyenne mother. He had been a man of gentle words and weak convictions. He had loved her mother, but he had loved the approval of his own people more. After Lena's mother died of a fever, swept away in a week, Jean-Paul had been lost. He looked at his young daughter, a child who was a constant, living reminder of a love his world condemned, and he could not bear the burden. "He took me to a mission school," Lena said, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. "He told me I would be safe there. He said they would make me a proper lady. What he meant was that they would try to wash the Cheyenne out of me." She described the cold, hard life of the school, a place where she was caught between two worlds and belonged to neither. To the white children, she was a savage, an object of curiosity and scorn. To the other native children who had been torn from their families and forced there, she was a half-breed, a traitor, the face of the enemy in their midst. She was rejected by both sides of her heritage. "I learned to be alone there," she continued, her voice devoid of self-pity. "I learned to depend on no one." She ran away when she was 16, taking with her only the clothes on her back and the stories her mother had told her, stories of the earth and its secrets. She had been surviving on her own ever since, living on the fringes, bearing the sting of rejection from a world that had no place for a woman like her. As her story faded into the quiet of the cabin, a profound shift occurred. Their confessions, spoken into the heart of the storm, had created a bridge between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman, a white and a half-breed, trapped by a blizzard. They were two survivors, two souls who understood the elemental nature of loss and the crushing weight of isolation. In his violent, sudden tragedy, she saw the echo of her own slow, grinding loneliness. In her story of rejection, he saw the mirror of his own self-imposed exile. They were two different kinds of broken, but they were broken in a way that the other could finally understand. The cabin was no longer a prison. It had become a sanctuary. The silence that returned was not the tense, awkward silence of before, but a comfortable quiet, filled with a new and unspoken understanding. The physical space between them began to shrink. That night, instead of sleeping in his chair, Elias laid a bedroll on the floor near the hearth, closer to her cot, to make sure the fire kept her warm through the worst of the night. He fell into an exhausted sleep, and sometime in the deep, dark hours, Lena rose quietly and draped a thick woolen blanket over his sleeping form. When the blizzard finally broke on the fourth morning, the world was born anew. The wind was gone, and a profound, holy silence had taken its place. Elias opened the cabin door to a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white snow. The sun was brilliant in a clear blue sky, its light dazzling on the untrodden landscape. Lena came to stand beside him in the doorway, breathing in the cold, clean air. She was well enough to leave now, to make her way back to her dugout. But as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the silent, beautiful world, the thought of returning to their separate, lonely lives felt like an impossibility, a kind of death that neither of them was willing to face. They had survived the storm outside, and in doing so, had found a fragile shelter in each other. The great white silence of the blizzard gave way to a world of mud and melt. For a week, the sun shone with a surprising warmth, and the plains began to shed their heavy blanket of snow, the water running in countless small rivulets that carved new paths through the amber grass. When the ground was firm enough for travel, Lena announced she was returning to her dugout. There was no grand declaration, no discussion of what would come next. There was simply a quiet packing of her few belongings and a moment of stillness at the cabin door. He handed her a small sack with some dried meat and coffee. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, an unspoken agreement passed between them. This was not an ending. It was a pause. He watched her walk away, her figure small and determined against the vast, open land, until she was just a speck on the horizon. The cabin, which had felt crowded and tense with her presence, now felt cavernously empty. The silence that returned was not the familiar, comfortable silence of his solitude, but a hollow, aching quiet that was far worse. He found himself listening for the sound of her breathing, for the soft shuffle of her movements, but there was only the sigh of the wind. A few days later, he saddled his horse. He told himself he was just going to check on her, to see if her dugout roof had survived the weight of the snow. It was a flimsy excuse, and he knew it. He loaded his saddlebags with provisions he knew she would be low on: a sack of flour, a slab of salted pork, and a generous tin of coffee. He rode over, his heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He found her reinforcing the entrance to her home with new timbers. She looked up as he approached, a small, unreadable smile on her face. They did not speak of the storm or the days they had spent together. He simply unloaded the supplies, and she invited him to share a meal. This became their new routine. Every few days, he would find a reason to ride over, his visits a quiet rebellion against the loneliness that had defined both their lives, a lifeline thrown across the empty miles between them. Their love story unfolded not in words, but in a series of simple, shared moments that stood out like wildflowers against the harsh landscape. He helped her shore up the dugout, his raw strength a quiet comfort as he lifted heavy logs into place and secured the sod roof. He was a competent man, his hands sure and his movements efficient, and she found a deep sense of security in his steady presence. In return, she began to open her world to him. She walked him through the prairie, showing him which plants could be brewed into a tea to settle the stomach, and which leaves, when crushed, could soothe the sting of an insect bite or a rope burn. Her knowledge, passed down from her mother, was a source of wonder to him. He had lived on this land for years but had only ever seen it as something to be tamed, to be wrestled into submission. She showed him that it was also a thing to be understood, a provider of subtle gifts if one only knew where to look. They shared meals, sitting on a log outside her dwelling as the sun went down. Her simple stews, made with rabbit she had snared and wild roots she had dug, were a vast improvement on his own bachelor fare. They ate in a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who no longer needed to fill the space between them with meaningless chatter. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and violet, their hands, resting on the log between them, brushed. The contact was brief, accidental. But it sent a jolt through Elias like a bolt of lightning. It was the first touch of a woman that was not born of necessity or emergency since Sarah. It was a touch of simple closeness, of warmth, and it terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He was visibly shaken, his breath catching in his throat. But he did not pull away. He let his hand rest there, a fraction of an inch from hers, the heat of her skin a brand on his senses. The weeks passed, and the fragile connection between them deepened, growing stronger with each visit, each shared meal, each quiet look. The emotional climax came one warm afternoon. Weeks after the touch on the log, he found her by the creek that ran near his property, the same creek Silas Croft coveted. She was washing her hair, and she had it unbound, a cascade of raven black silk that fell nearly to her waist. She had never worn it down in his presence before, and the sight of her, so natural and unguarded, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was overwhelmed by a rush of feeling, a fierce, protective tenderness, a deep, aching desire, and a terrifying, resurgent hope. It was a torrent of emotion that threatened to drown the man he had been for the past 5 years. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching her. She looked up and saw him, and a small, shy smile touched her lips. He walked over and sat on the grassy bank beside her. For a long time, he said nothing, just listened to the gurgle of the creek and the buzz of insects in the tall grass. Finally, he found his voice. It was rough, but it was honest. "I haven't felt much of anything for a long time." "Lena," he began, his eyes on the moving water. "Nothing but grief. Mostly. It was like I was living in a long, gray winter, and I had forgotten what the sun felt like." He turned to look at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw vulnerability. "Since the storm, since you, it feels like the sun is coming out again. You make me feel alive." Lena listened, her own heart aching with a feeling she had never allowed herself to have. She had been valued for her endurance, for her ability to survive, but she had never been truly seen, not like this. No man had ever looked at her and seen past the color of her skin or the circumstances of her birth. They had seen an object of curiosity, of scorn, or of crude desire. Elias saw her. "No one has ever said anything like that to me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I have never felt valued. Not by a man. I have always been something other, something on the outside." In that moment of shared vulnerability, with the truth of their lonely lives laid bare between them, the world seemed to fall away. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of deep, soul-shattering relief. It was a recognition, a coming home. For Elias, it was the breaking of a long and terrible fast. For Lena, it was the first taste of a sanctuary she had never known existed. In that kiss, on the bank of the quiet creek, they made a silent promise to be that sanctuary for each other in a hostile world. But a hostile world does not ignore such promises. It seeks to break them. Their burgeoning relationship did not go unnoticed. Silas Croft, his envy a sour taste in his mouth, saw Elias's horse tied outside Lena's dugout with increasing frequency. He began to spread malicious rumors in the saloon, his words dripping with poison. He painted Lena as a cunning temptress, a heathen squaw who had used her strange ways to bewitch the grieving, vulnerable rancher. He hinted that she was after Elias's land, that she was a parasite looking for a host. The rumors found fertile ground in the righteous soil of Prairie Creek. Reverend Miller, hearing the whispers, saw his own dire prophecies coming to pass. From his pulpit, he picked up the theme, delivering thunderous sermons about the dangers of mixing with heathens, about the wolves in sheep's clothing who threatened the moral fabric of their godly community. He spoke of righteous men led astray by earthly temptations, his eyes seeming to bore into the very soul of his congregation, warning them of the moral decay that threatened to rot their town from within. The town's prejudice, once a passive force of whispers and stares, began to curdle and solidify into active hostility. Elias felt the change immediately. It was like a shift in the wind before a storm. Men who had once offered a curt nod as he passed now turned their backs, their faces hard and closed. When he rode into town for supplies, he was met with a wall of cold silence. The blacksmith, a man he had known for years, claimed a stone had worked its way into his horse's hoof and, in removing it, accidentally lamed the animal, forcing Elias to walk the long miles home, leading the limping horse behind him. At the general store, Mr. Henderson, his face a mask of false regret, suddenly claimed to be out of the specific brand of coffee Elias always bought, out of the grade of flour he needed. The hostility escalated. One night, he returned to his ranch after dark to find a 20-foot section of his fence cut, the wires snipped clean. A dozen head of his best cattle were gone, scattered into the open range. It took him 2 days of hard, sun-up to sundown riding to round them all up. He had no proof, but he knew with a cold certainty that it was Croft's doing. It was a direct attack on his livelihood, a warning. The external pressure, which was meant to drive them apart, had the opposite effect. It was like a fire that tempers steel, burning away any lingering doubts and forging their bond into something unbreakable. Their love became their fortress, a bastion against the hatred of the world. One evening, as he was about to ride back to his own empty cabin, Lena stopped him. "Stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is foolish. All this riding back and forth. My home is here." She looked at him, then amended her statement. "Our home is here." The next day, she moved into Elias's cabin. It was a decision that was both practical and a definitive statement to the world. They were together now, for better or for worse. The cabin transformed. It was no longer the Spartan, lonely shelter of a grieving man. With a few of Lena's touches, a jar of wildflowers on the table, the smell of herbs drying from the rafters, the neat mending of his clothes, it became a home. Their life together settled into an island of peace in a sea of hostility. Their domestic routines were filled with a quiet affection that often flared into a passion that was all the more powerful for having been denied for so long. Their joy in each other was a quiet, private thing, a secret garden they tended in the midst of a barren land. Then, in the late summer, that joy was compounded by a discovery that was both a miracle and a terror. Lena was pregnant. For Lena, who had never expected to find love, let alone a family, the news was a quiet, profound miracle. A lifetime of being an outcast had taught her not to hope for such things. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, a look of awe and wonder on her face. But for Elias, the news was the ultimate test of his courage. He looked at Lena, at the joy shining in her eyes, and a wave of ice-cold terror washed over him. The joy of their union was instantly shadowed by the full, crushing weight of his past, the scent of lavender and blood, the terrifying silence that followed a single, weak cry, the image of Sarah's pale, lifeless face. It all came crashing down upon him. He had found love again. He had found a reason to live again. And now, he was being forced to stare into a future that held two stark, terrible possibilities: the ultimate redemption of a new life, or a tragedy so profound, so nightmarishly familiar, that he knew it would utterly destroy him. The first months of Lena's pregnancy passed in a season of fragile joy. Their life in the small cabin settled into a rhythm of quiet, domestic bliss, a stark contrast to the simmering hostility of the world outside their door. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace, a constant undercurrent of anxiety ran swift and cold. It lived inside Elias, a low-grade terror that was the shadow cast by his profound love for Lena and their unborn child. He was fiercely protective, his attentiveness a double-edged sword. He would watch her constantly, his gaze so intense it was almost a physical weight. If she sighed from the effort of rising from a chair, he was instantly at her side, his face a mask of concern, If she mentioned a small ache in her back, a jolt of raw fear would flash in his eyes. He catered to her every need before she could voice it, bringing her water, insisting she rest, taking over even the lightest of her chores. Lena understood that this hovering care was the shape of his love, but she could also see the ghosts that swam behind his eyes. She saw them in the way he would fall silent in the middle of a sentence, his mind clearly replaying some terrible scene from his past. The nights were the worst. More than once, she was woken by his strangled cry. She would find him sitting bolt upright in their bed, drenched in a cold sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He would never speak of what he saw in his sleep, but she knew. He was reliving Sarah's labor, trapped in a recurring nightmare of blood and failure. He would hold Lena then, his arms trembling, as if trying to physically anchor himself to the present, to the warmth and life of her body. But he could not shake the deep, gut-wrenching feeling that he was a man doomed to repeat his failures, that this second chance at happiness was just a cruel trick of fate, a prelude to a sorrow even greater than the one he already carried. His struggle was a silent, violent war waged within the confines of his own mind. He was caught in a brutal crossfire between the profound hope Lena had given him and the paralyzing trauma that held him hostage. The love he felt was a revitalizing force, a spring thaw in the frozen landscape of his soul. But the fear was a winter that would not release its grip, its tendrils of ice reaching for the new life that was growing inside the woman he loved. He fought it the only way he knew how, with work. He threw himself into the relentless labor of the ranch, trying to exhaust the fear from his body, to sweat it out under the harsh Wyoming sun until he was too tired to think, too tired to dream. In the small barn, he began to build a cradle. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, his hands, usually so steady, sometimes shaking with the force of his emotions. He chose the wood with infinite care, smooth, strong pine, and worked it with a reverence that was akin to prayer. Every pass of the planing tool, every turn of the screw, was a plea to a God he was no longer sure he believed in. He was not just building a bed for his child. He was trying to construct a vessel of safety, a wooden fortress against the terrible possibilities that haunted him. He sanded the wood until it was as smooth as river stone, the rockers perfectly balanced, the finished piece a work of sturdy, simple beauty. When it was done, he carried it into the cabin and placed it near the hearth, a tangible symbol of his hope standing in defiance of his fear. Lena watched his struggle with a quiet, steady heart. Her strength and pragmatism were a balm on his raw nerves. She would not allow his fear to become the center of their world. One evening, as he sat staring at the cradle, his face a landscape of torment, she came and sat beside him, taking his large, calloused hand in her own. "My mother had 5 children," she said softly, her voice a calm anchor in his turbulent thoughts. "She had them all out on the plains, with only her sister to help her. She used to say that birth is a battle, but a woman's body is the battlefield, and she is the general. She said the pain is a guide, not an enemy." She told him about Cheyenne birthing traditions, of the strength of the women in her family, of their knowledge of herbs to ease the pain and their unwavering faith in the power of a woman's body to bring forth life. She was offering him an alternative narrative, a story of strength and resilience to place alongside the one of failure and death that played on a loop in his mind. He listened, squeezing her hand, wanting so desperately to believe her, to believe that this time could be different. As the months passed and Lena's belly grew round and full, Elias's desperation increased. The stories Lena told were a comfort, but they were not enough to quell the terror that rose in him as her time grew near. He needed a doctor. He needed the certainty of modern medicine, a shield against the kind of calamity that had destroyed his first family. One morning, he made a decision. He told Lena he would be gone for a few days to check on a distant corner of the herd. It was a lie. He packed a bag with jerky and a canteen and rode east. His destination was Cheyenne, the next major town, A grueling 60-mile journey that took him 2 full days of hard riding. The city was a chaotic, bustling place, a world away from the quiet solitude of his ranch. He found the doctor's office, a small, respectable-looking building, and stated his case to a portly, well-dressed man with a dismissive air. He explained the situation, the remoteness of his ranch, his wife's impending delivery. The doctor listened with a bored expression, then named his price. He would require an exorbitant sum of money to travel so far and stay for an unknown length of time. It was more money than Elias had seen in 5 years, more than he could possibly afford. He tried to bargain, his pride crumbling into a desperate plea, but the doctor was unmoved. Elias left the office, defeated. The long ride home a journey of crushing despair. His last hope was a sliver of a chance, and it required him to swallow what was left of his pride. He rode into Prairie Creek and tied his horse outside the combination barbershop and surgery, the domain of a man named Henderson. Henderson was the town's barber and tooth puller, a man with some rudimentary medical knowledge and a reputation for being more sober than the last doctor. Elias entered the shop, the bell jangling, and found Henderson stropping a razor. He laid out the situation, his voice low and strained, asking, begging for the man to come when the time came. Henderson stopped his work. He would not meet Elias's eye. He fidgeted with the razor, his face pale. "I am sorry, Vance," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I am not equipped for that sort of thing. A delivery can be complicated. I would not want to do more harm than good." It was a flimsy excuse, a coward's lie. In the man's shifty gaze, Elias saw the truth. He saw the long shadows of Reverend Miller's sermons and the town's unified scorn. Henderson would not risk his standing in the community, would not risk being ostracized himself, to help the man who lived with the heathen woman. He would not help deliver a child the town had already condemned. Elias turned and walked out without another word, the door closing behind him on his last hope for help. The town had closed its ranks. The social prejudice that had been a thing of whispers and turned backs now became an active, menacing force. Silas Croft, emboldened by Elias's complete isolation and the town's tacit approval, decided to make his move. The creek that watered Elias's land and his herd ran first through a corner of Croft's property. One morning, Elias rode out to find Croft and 2 of his ranch hands driving posts into the creek bed, beginning to construct a crude dam. It was a direct and open threat, an attempt to choke off the lifeblood of Elias's ranch and force him out. Elias dismounted, his body rigid with a cold, controlled fury. He walked to the edge of the creek. "This water runs to my land. Croft," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "This is my land." "Vance," he sneered. "I will do with the water what I please." It was a tense standoff. Elias was alone, outnumbered, but in his eyes was the look of a man who had already lost everything once and had absolutely nothing left to fear. There would be no fists, no guns. This was a battle of wills. "If you build that dam," Elias said, his voice as flat and hard as stone, "I will tear it down. And if you try to stop me, you will find out what a man with nothing to lose is capable of." Croft looked at Elias, at the unyielding certainty in his eyes, and, for the first time, a flicker of fear entered his own. He saw not the grieving recluse, but a man pushed to the very edge, a man who would not break, with a curse. Croft waved his men off. "It is not worth the trouble," he grumbled. He backed down, for now, but the threat lingered in the air like the coming winter. Elias rode home with a grim, chilling realization. They were well and truly alone. They were a pariah family, an island in a sea of hate, living in a land that offered no quarter and no mercy. He began to prepare for a siege. He spent the next week stockpiling supplies, buying far more than he needed for the winter. He reinforced the shutters on the cabin, checked the seals on the doors, and shored up the walls of the barn. He was turning their home into a fortress. not just against the coming snows, but against the malice of their neighbors. As if in sympathy with their plight, nature itself began to turn on them. The weather grew foul. A strange, early autumn storm began to brew on the horizon. The sky, for days, took on a bruised greenish-gray color, a sign of violent weather to come. The wind picked up, carrying the first stinging flecks of sleet, and moaned around the cabin with a new, mournful voice. It was the kind of storm that old-timers talked about for years, one that came too early and with an unnatural, predatory ferocity. Elias and Lena prepared for the worst. They worked together in a grim, silent partnership, securing the livestock in the newly reinforced barn, bringing in mountains of firewood, and boarding up the windows against the coming gale. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive, electric charge. The world outside the cabin grew dark, the light fading as if it were being swallowed by the malevolent sky. Inside the darkening cabin, lit only by a single lantern, the atmosphere was thick with dread, as the first true gale of wind hit the cabin walls like a physical blow, rattling the very timbers of the house. Lena suddenly doubled over with a sharp, sudden cry of pain. She gasped, her hands flying to her belly. Elias was at her side in an instant, his heart seizing in his chest. As he reached for her, a wave of icy water rushed down her legs, pooling on the floorboards. Her water had broken. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked from Lena's pained, frightened face to the newly boarded window, where the cracks of light were already disappearing into a maelstrom of snow and ice. His greatest fear, his most persistent and terrifying nightmare, had just come to life. The birth was here. It was too early, and the storm had sealed them in a tomb. Alone with the ghosts of his past, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. It was consumed by a sonic assault of pure, unrelenting fury. The wind no longer moaned, it shrieked, a high, thin sound of a world being torn apart. The boarded-up shutters rattled in their frames as if clawed at by some great beast, and the very timbers of the cabin groaned a deep, resonant note of protest, the sound of a ship breaking apart in a storm. This was the siege, and the night was just beginning. Inside, an equally violent storm was taking place. The cabin was a cave of dancing shadows, lit by a single, flickering lantern on the table. The light cast their elongated silhouettes against the log walls, making them writhe and twist like tormented spirits. The air was thick and heavy, charged with tension, fear, and the sharp, metallic scent of Lena's sweat. Time lost all meaning, stretching and compressing with each of her ragged breaths. Lena's labor was a brutal, merciless thing. There was no rhythm to it, no gentle building and receding. The contractions came like a series of crashing waves, one after another, with no respite in between, giving her no time to recover, no moment to catch her breath. She was trapped in a relentless tide of agony, her body a vessel being torn apart from the inside. Elias was a ghost at the edge of the storm. He did what he could, his movements clumsy and desperate. He followed the instructions she gasped out between the waves of pain, his mind a numb fog of terror. He kept a pot of water boiling over the fire, though he had no idea why, only that it was what people did. He held her hand, his own large, rough palm swallowing her smaller one, feeling the bones grind together as she squeezed with inhuman strength. He wiped her brow with a damp cloth, trying to offer a comfort that felt pitifully inadequate against the sheer scale of her suffering. He was a passive observer to a battle he could not fight, and the helplessness was a bitter acid eating him alive. With every one of her pained cries, he heard an echo, "Sarah!" The sound transported him back 5 years, to this very cabin, to this very bed. The room became a time loop, trapping him in the worst day of his life. Lena's gasps were Sarah's gasps. The sweat on her brow was the sweat on Sarah's brow. He fought to stay present, to focus on Lena's face, on the fierce strength in her gray-green eyes. But the traumatic memories were overwhelming. a tidal wave of grief and failure that threatened to pull him under, to paralyze him completely. He felt the phantom weight of Sarah's cooling hand in his, heard the terrible, final silence that had followed his first child's weak cry. He was failing again. God was making him watch it all over again. Hours passed, a long, dark road with no end in sight. The storm outside did not slacken, and the storm inside only grew more vicious. Lena was exhausted, her body trembling with a fatigue so profound it was terrifying to witness. Her strength, which had seemed a bottomless well, was finally fading. The cries that had been torn from her throat were now weak, guttural moans, and nothing was happening. The labor was not progressing. They both knew it. An unspoken, shared certainty settled in the suffocating air of the cabin. Something was profoundly, terribly wrong. Lena, her face pale and slick with sweat, found a moment of clarity between the punishing contractions, using what she knew of her own body, of the stories of birth her mother had told her. She reached down, her eyes flew open, wide with a horrifying, absolute certainty. The color drained from her face, leaving it an ashen mask of terror. She looked at Elias, and the look in her eyes shattered what was left of his composure. "It's the baby's feet, Elias!" she gasped, her voice thin and ragged. "It's coming out the wrong way." The word was not spoken, but it hung in the air between them, a ghostly, damning presence. Breach. The same death sentence that had been passed on Sarah. The same impossible knot that had strangled the life from his wife and child 5 years ago. This was it. The nightmare made real. The curse fulfilling itself. Elias froze. His mind, which had been racing with panic and memory, simply stopped. A cold, dreadful numbness spread through him. A retreat into the familiar, hollow place of his grief. This was not happening again. It could not be. He could only stare at her, at the taut swell of her belly, which had been a symbol of hope and was now a tomb. He began to shake his head, a slow, disbelieving denial. No, not again. Seeing him break, seeing the last flicker of hope drain from his face to be replaced by the dead look of surrender. Lena found a last, impossible reserve of strength. She let go of his hand and gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with the force of a trap. Her voice, when it came, was not a plea but a command, a raw, desperate rasp that somehow cut through the howl of the storm and the roar of his own despair. "Elias, look at me." He did not want to. He wanted to close his eyes and fall into the abyss, but the sheer force of her will compelled him. He dragged his gaze from the floor and forced his eyes to meet hers. They were filled with an agony that mirrored his own, but behind the pain was something else, something that stunned him. It was a fierce, unwavering, absolute trust. "You can't let me die," she rasped, her body arching as another contraction tore through her. She gasped for breath, her eyes never leaving his. "You can't let our baby die." She held his gaze, pinning him with the force of her conviction. "I'm begging you, hurry up." He did not understand. The words made no sense. He was helpless. He was a failure. He had been a witness to this exact horror before, and he knew how it ended. "What can I do?" he cried, his voice finally breaking, a sound of utter desolation. And then she told him. Her words were faint, punctuated by gasps of pain, but they were clear and deliberate. She spoke of stories she had heard from her mother, old stories from the Cheyenne, of desperate measures taken on the plains, far from any help, when a mother was lost but the child could still be saved. But she was not giving up. Her eyes burned into his, and he realized with a jolt of horror that she was not talking about saving the baby after she was gone. She was asking him to do something that went against every fiber of his being, against nature, against God. She was asking him to cut the baby out of her. The idea was so monstrous, so barbaric, that Elias recoiled as if she had struck him. He stared at her in disbelief, his mind refusing to process the words. He thought of butchering cattle, of the slick, bloody, visceral reality of it. He thought of the deep, clean cut of the knife, the steam rising from the opened flesh, the smell of life spilling onto the ground. To do that to her, to Lena? He looked down at his own hands, calloused, stained with the dirt and grease of his work. Hands meant for roping and branding and mending fences. They were strong hands, capable hands, but they were the hands of a rancher, not a surgeon. They were instruments of force, not of delicate, life-saving work. This was the story's central, terrible climax. He was trapped between two impossible choices, each a path to a different kind of hell. He could do nothing, and watch the woman he loved die the same agonizing death as his first wife, repeating his past failure in every horrifying detail. Or he could commit an act of violent, primitive surgery, a brutal butchery that would almost certainly kill her anyway, making him not just a failure, but a murderer. He was shaking, great, uncontrollable tremors racking his body. He began to weep, deep, ragged sobs of a man utterly broken. He looked at the long, sharp knife he used for skinning animals, its blade gleaming in the lantern light. He looked at Lena's belly, taut and straining with a life trapped inside. Then he looked into her eyes, and in them he saw no fear of him. He saw no terror of the knife, or of the brutal act she was asking him to perform. He saw only a desperate, absolute faith. She was placing her life, and the life of their child, into his clumsy, shaking, unworthy hands. In that moment, his love for her, the love that had been his redemption, that had pulled him from the grave of his own grief, became a force more powerful than his fear, more powerful than his despair, more powerful than the ghosts that haunted him. It was a terrible, beautiful, clarifying force. He made his choice. With a choked sob that was half prayer, half curse, he leaned close to her and said, "Tell me what to do." He moved as if in a trance. He took a bottle of whiskey from the shelf and poured it over his hands. The sting of the alcohol a sharp dose of reality. He poured it over the blade of the skinning knife. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air burning in his lungs. He handed Lena a thick strip of leather. She put it between her teeth and bit down hard, her eyes closing, her body bracing for an agony beyond imagination. He moved the lantern closer, its light pooling on her skin. He knelt beside the bed. He stepped closer, and then he did the unthinkable. The narrative of the world narrowed to his perspective, to the horrific, intimate details of the act. He felt the unnatural resistance as the tip of the knife broke the skin, a feeling that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. A prayer was on his lips, a frantic, incoherent babble to any god that might be listening. He saw the horrific sight of his own hands, those rough rancher's hands, performing this terrible, necessary act of love and brutality. Every second was an eternity. The room was silent save for the howl of the storm and the muffled, agonizing sounds from Lena. It was a nightmare of blood and desperation, all of it driven by a desperate, all-consuming love for the woman and child he refused to lose. The scene ended not with a triumphant cry of success, but with a sound that cut through the roaring wind and the pounding of his own heart. It was the fragile, shocking, miraculous wail of a newborn baby. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, there was another sound. The sound of nothing. The dead. Terrifying silence from Lena. The blizzard broke with the dawn. It did not fade or recede, but simply stopped, leaving behind a world remade. Outside the cabin, a pristine, deathly white silence descended. The plains buried under a blanket of snow so deep it softened every edge and erased every path. The sun rose into a sky of impossible clarity, its light glittering on a landscape of breathless, frozen beauty. But the silence inside the cabin was more profound, more terrible. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. Elias sat on a stool by the fire, his body slumped in a posture of utter exhaustion. He was covered in blood. His hands, his arms, his shirt were stained a dark, rusty brown. In his lap, wrapped in a clean blanket, lay a tiny, squalling miracle. The baby's cries were thin, but surprisingly strong, a furious assertion of life in the quiet, blood-soaked room. On the bed, Lena lay terrifyingly still. Her skin, which had always held the warm tones of the sun, was pale and waxy in the thin morning light. A sheen of sweat beaded on her brow, and her breathing was a shallow, fluttering thing, barely stirring the rough wool blanket that covered her. He had a son. He may have lost his wife. The moment was a dizzying, horrific vertigo, a collision of a miracle and a tragedy so absolute that his mind could not hold on to either one. The baby cried, and his heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. He looked at Lena, and his soul fractured with a grief that was terrifyingly familiar. But the man who had sat helpless by his first wife's deathbed was not the same man who sat here now. Elias was shattered, scraped hollow by the horrors of the night. But he was not broken. The same desperate love that had driven him to commit the unthinkable act now fueled a methodical, desperate fight for Lena's life. He would not be a passive witness this time. He would fight. He laid the baby, now quiet and sleeping, in the beautiful cradle he had built with such hope and fear. Then he turned his attention to Lena. He cleaned the brutal wound on her abdomen as best he can, his stomach churning, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the cloth. He found the canvas needle and thick thread he used for mending saddles and feed sacks, sterilizing it in the flame of the lantern. He began the grisly, necessary task of stitching her closed. Each clumsy push of the needle through her skin was an act of both desecration and devotion, a prayer whispered through gritted teeth. Her fever began to rage, her body burning with a fire that threatened to consume her from within. He remembered the herbs she had shown him, the leaves she had gathered and dried for this very purpose. He found the yarrow she had set aside and brewed a bitter, pungent tea. He gently pried her lips apart and used a spoon to force droplets of the liquid into her mouth, praying that some of it would find its way down her throat. For the next 3 days, he was a ghost. He did not sleep. He did not rest. He moved in a relentless cycle of duty, a automaton powered by black coffee, raw fear, and a prayer that had become a constant, running mantra in his head. Please, God, not again. Not this one. Let me keep this one. He tended to Lena's fever, bathing her forehead and forcing more of the tea between her lips. He tended to the baby, feeding the tiny, hungry mouth with a clean rag dipped in watered-down milk from the cow he kept in the barn. And he tended the fire, keeping the hearth roaring, a beacon of warmth against the cold that was trying to claim the woman he loved. On the 4th day, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck moving slowly across the blinding white snow. It was Silas Croft. His curiosity and a thick vein of malice had gotten the better of him. The storm was over, and no one had seen a hint of movement from the Vance cabin. He expected to find a scene of grim finality, to confirm the rumors that would surely start to fly about the squaw's death in childbirth. He imagined finding Vance a broken, weeping man, a sight that would give him a deep, satisfying pleasure. He dismounted and crept to the cabin window, peering through a small section of the board he had pried loose. The sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. It was a scene from a nightmare. He saw the pile of blood-soaked linens in the corner. He saw the woman on the bed, pale as death, and as Elias leaned over to change the dressing, Croft saw the raw, angry, stitched wound that crossed her abdomen. And he saw Elias. The man was gaunt, his eyes burning like red coals in the dark hollows of his unshaven face. He cradled the tiny baby to his chest with a fierce, protective tenderness that was terrifying in its intensity. He looked less like a man and more like a wolf standing over its mate, exhausted and bloodied from a battle, but ready to kill anything that dared to come closer. Croft saw not a scene of sin to be judged, but a tableau of such raw, primal survival and desperation that it unnerved him to his very core. This was not a story of a man led astray. This was a story of a man who had gone to war with death itself. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He backed away from the window, turned his horse, and rode away without a word. A seed of grudging, fearful respect planted in the barren soil of his mind. That night, Lena's fever broke. Elias was dozing in the chair, his head slumped on his chest, when a sound from the bed brought him instantly awake. She had moaned, a soft, conscious sound. He was at her side in a heartbeat. Her skin, which had been burning hot, was now cool and damp. Her breathing was deeper, more even. She was still asleep, but it was the sleep of healing, not of death. He fell to his knees, rested his forehead against the edge of her bed, and wept with a relief so profound it left him weak. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to heal. Her return to consciousness, a day later, was the story's final, quiet, emotional peak. She opened her eyes, her gaze clouded and confused at first. Then her eyes found Elias. He was sitting by the bed, holding their son. He looked gaunt, unshaven, and more exhausted than any man she had ever seen. But in his eyes was a look of such profound love that it took her breath away. He saw that she was awake, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his tired face. He leaned forward and placed the warm, sleeping bundle of their son into her arms. There were no grand speeches. There were no words at all. Their connection was beyond that now. As she held their child for the first time, her fingers tracing the baby's perfect, tiny features. Her eyes met Elias's. In that look, everything was said. They had faced the absolute worst that man, nature, and fate could throw at them. And they had survived. Their love, forged in the terror of a blizzard and tempered in the blood of a nightmare, had come out stronger than steel. The quiet days of her recovery that followed were filled with a profound peace and a deep tenderness that felt earned and sacred. A gift they had wrested from the jaws of hell itself. Word of what happened, as it always does, spread through Prairie Creek. It was carried first by Silas Croft's stunned, reluctant silence, then pieced together through rumor and fear until it became a grim frontier legend. The town's prejudice did not vanish, but it shifted, transformed. The open hostility was replaced by a wary, superstitious awe. They no longer saw Elias as a sinner who had bedded a heathen. They saw him as a man who had wrestled with death in a blood-soaked cabin during a blizzard and had won. Reverend Miller's condemnations from the pulpit now sounded hollow and shrill. The pronouncements of a man who spoke of damnation but had never looked it in the eye. But Elias and Lena realized they did not want the town's acceptance. It was a poisoned well. They had not endured what they had endured to win the approval of cowards and hypocrites. Their justice would not be found in changing the minds of hateful people. Their justice was in the quiet, sleeping breaths of the child in the cradle. It was in the new, hard-won strength returning to Lena's body. It was in the unbreakable, unspoken bond between them. That was their victory. That was all that mattered. The story ends a few months later. In the full blush of spring, the plains, released from the grip of winter, were a riot of new green, dotted with the bright, hopeful colors of wildflowers. A sturdy wagon stood packed in front of the cabin. Elias and Lena were leaving. They were leaving the ranch, the town, the hostile stares, and the ghosts that haunted the small hill behind the cabin. They were heading west. A traveling trapper had told Elias of a valley, nestled in the mountains, a place of clean water and deep solitude where a family could build a life on their own terms. The final image is of their wagon moving slowly across the vast, green landscape. Elias drove, holding the reins with a light, easy touch, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. Lena sat beside him on the wagon bench, their son, Daniel, cradled in her arms. Her face was turned toward the future, toward the distant, hazy line of the mountains on the horizon. They were not running from a past they had so brutally defeated. They were moving toward a horizon they had earned together, side by side. Their survival was their victory, and their love. now and forever, was their home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.